Congress, and of course some fantastic guests from Canada. Now we're being joined by somebody who riveted us at the last Concordia Forum in Blue Mountain, spent 3 days with us, and gave the keynote speech and shared some wonderful anecdotes. And I'm so delighted that he's made the time to join us here again. We're also joined, of course, I'm talking about the mayor, but I shouldn't be doing the introductions because the job of introductions is over to Zain Velji. Zain, sorry, I had to say something about Mayor Nenshi, but I'm going to stop introducing and hand over to you to introduce both the panelists and moderate the session from here. Over to you.
How dare you step on my toes, Mudassir? How dare you do that? Assalamu alaikum, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Zain Velji, as Mudassir said, and it is honestly my pleasure today to introduce this chat that we're going to be having with both mayors Naheed Nenshi and Mayor Sunbul Siddiqui of Calgary and of Cambridge, respectively. You know, I before I get into the introductions, I think this is going to be such a opportune time to have this chat because, you know, as my friend Mayor Nenshi, or Naheed as I call him, and I may refer to him without his mayoral title occasionally on this call, he often says that municipal governments is the order of government that touches people's lives most directly. And in a midst of a crisis, a pandemic, the reordering of what everything looks like, it's going to be municipal governments that are going to be on the front lines of reinventing and rethinking what cities look like, what our streets look like, what our transit looks like. The tweaking, the tinkering is going to be left up to our cities to be our front line of what our lives look like after this pandemic across the world. So I am absolutely delighted to have both mayors joining us today. I'll give a brief introduction and then we'll kind of jump into some Q&A. As Mudassir mentioned, Mayor Naheed Nenshi of Calgary was sworn in as Calgary's 36th mayor in October 2010. Prior to be electing mayor, Mayor Nenshi was with McKinsey & Company, later forming his own business to help public, private, and nonprofit organizations. He was also awarded the 2014 World Mayor Prize by the UK-based City Mayors Foundation as the world's best mayor. He holds a Bachelor of Commerce from U of C and a Master's in Public Policy from the Harvard Kennedy School, based in, of course, Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we also have Mayor Sunbul Siddiqui, who's currently serving her second term on Cambridge City Council and her first term as mayor of Cambridge. She was raised in Cambridge and raised in Cambridge affordable housing, and she immigrated from Pakistan with her family. And after graduating with a bachelor's degree in public policy from Brown University, Mayor Siddiqui served on a AmeriCorps fellow at New Profit, and then a Cambridge-based nonprofit organization, and earning her JD from Northwestern's School of Law. Two unbelievably impressive individuals if they did not even have the title of mayor. But I mean, we're in for a rich chat. So Mayor Siddiqui, maybe I can start with you. Before we get into the whole pandemic conversation, which I know I want to get deeply into and how that's affecting cities, tell us about yourself. Tell us about the thrust that kind of led to you wanting to serve publicly. What kind of, you know, this pedigree I just read, for what reason did that kind of lead to public service and city council? Give us that story.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me today. Look forward to the conversation. So I think for me early on, I saw that there are so many resources in Cambridge that I could benefit from. And I got this, you know, strong sense of wanting to help others as a result, because of these resources that had been provided to me and my family. And so early on, I think I told my parents, I'm not going to be a doctor. I'm not going to be doing this. I want to just help people. And they're like, all right, okay, well, what do you mean by that? And I think eventually, after studying public policy, doing some fellowships, and then going to law school, I decided to do legal aid. And so so that really thrust me into wanting to then in the future figure out my interest in policy, and then my skill with working one-on-one with people, and how do I merge that. And so I decided to run for office in 2017, and it's worked out. You never know with elections, but I think my message resonated with people, and especially because this is my hometown, I think that definitely made a difference. And so here I am.
It's a fantastic story. Thank you for sharing with us. Marianenshi, same question to you, right? In 2010, you were elected. It was for those who may know and have read of the story, it was a come from behind victory. You were not supposed to win, so they say. But tell us what kind of let you to put your name on that ballot. What was the culmination of that moment? Oh, you're on mute.
You would think after 20 hours a day of Zoom calls in the last several weeks, I would have figured out when I'm on mute and when I'm not. Thanks for the question, Zain. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Happy Mother's Day to those watching in North America. So it's an interesting question. And so like Mayor Siddiqui, I grew up in this town and grew up in a family that didn't have a lot of money, but what I never lacked in was opportunity. I graduated from excellent public schools. I haunted the public library on Saturday afternoons. I explored the city on public transit. I tried to learn to swim very badly in a public pool. And I have been so very lucky to have been blessed to have that opportunity and to grow up in a community that had a stake in me, that had a stake in my success. So I was able to go off and do other things. I worked for McKinsey. I was a management consultant for a long time. And I decided just before I turned 30 that I wanted to come home. I was living and traveling kind of all over the world. And I wanted to come home, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do when I got here. And I sort of stumbled into life as an academic. But it never really left me the whole idea of doing seva, of doing service in the community. And even as an academic, I was a terrible professor. But the research that I was trying to do really was around civic engagement, how and why people get involved in their communities, and also around municipal government generally, in terms of how municipal government, which often is the least visible order of government, could be better. And so exactly 10 years ago, in fact, 10 years ago this week, now that I think about it, I made a choice. And basically I had spent about a year trying to convince other people that they should run for city council and run for mayor. Because what I had learned in my work, actually, and sorry for taking such a long time to answer a question, I always do that. I'm sure Mayor Siddiqui, you're good at sound bites. I am not. But one of the things I learned in my research is that it's actually very easy to get people involved in the community. The number one reason that people don't volunteer is not lack of time or lack of money. It's that nobody asked me. And so we had thought about, when I was an academic, ways that you ask people, ways you get people involved in volunteerism and in the community. But what we also learned is that it's very hard to get people involved in government for all the reasons you would think. Doesn't matter who wins. None of them are focused on me and what I need. None of them are focused on the needs of my family. People are very deeply cynical. And so I thought we should change that. And I spent a lot of time trying to convince other people that they should run for office. And so many people said to me, if you're so keen on this, why aren't you doing it yourself? And I sort of went, I'm not a politician, right? Politicians are, good looking and charismatic and like people and enjoy kissing babies and enjoy children. And I don't like any of those things. But enough people said to me, listen, you got to put your money where your mouth is. You can't be a bystander. If there's an opportunity for you to serve and you think you can do a good job, you got to try it. So exactly 10 years ago this week, I decided to launch sort of a quixotic campaign to see if citizens were interested in deeper conversations about their community and about their future. And as Zain says, I wasn't expected to win. So the background here, for those who don't know, is Zain was a volunteer on that campaign. That's where I first met him. And in my third campaign, Zain was my campaign manager. So these stories he has heard many times. But we went from literally 0% in the first poll against some 14 or 15 competitors to to winning, I should say, 6 months later, with about 40% of the vote in a very crowded field that included several members of city council, several provincial and federal representatives, and corporate and community leaders. So this kind of nerdy professor learned to like to kiss babies, and that's how we ended up here. And
I
now,
would be
3
remiss.
months later, we're still here.
I love that story. I've heard it so often, but I don't know if I've asked you this question. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask it in this forum. So to both of you, maybe I'll start with you first, Naheed, is what part did your faith play into you running? Not in the sense, and maybe even the sense for inspiring you to run, but did you consider it at any point as a hurdle? Did you was that something you put in the back of your mind? Was that in the front of your mind? I don't think I've ever asked you that question. So I'm kind of curious to hear your response to that.
Well, my faith and my upbringing played a very important role in my wanting to run, because that concept of service, that concept of seva for those from the South Asian community, has been a critical thing that I grew up with, that I always grew up with. And so for me, this was just another expression of seva. We just always believed in service and sacrifice. That's where we came from. Now, in terms of my faith, I didn't think about it too much, but I was a little bit nervous about it. I was a little bit nervous thinking, how will people respond to a Muslim growing up in this community now wanting to run for office? And, Ramadan happened during that campaign. And I deliberately didn't want to do the story about how does this candidate make 20 speeches a day while he's not eating or drinking. I just didn't think that was very useful. And so the issue of my faith actually came up twice during the campaign. The first time was we had an act of vandalism at our political office, which does happen from time to time, but it happened to happen on the night of September 11th. And so the question that was in a lot of minds was this the act of jerks, or was this the act of racist jerks? And what was interesting about that is that actually led to an enormous amount of, I guess, empathy for me. A lot of campaign donations rolled in that day saying, we want to help you fix your window. And it ended up being a lot more than that. But no one really minded much. Now, the other one was a more interesting one, which is, when you run for public office, the local newspaper interviews every candidate at the editorial board, and there's a reporter there, and you kind of get one profile of you over the course of the whole campaign. And my profile, even though my interview had nothing to do with it, was focused on the question, is Calgary ready for a Muslim mayor? And I was pretty irritated by that because, as I've said many, many times since then, growing up, I never thought there was any job that was closed to me because of my faith. Maybe rabbi, but nothing else. And so I was surprised that this question was even asked. And in fact, so were the readers of the newspaper. The newspaper got more calls into their newsroom on that story than any other story that year. And every one of those calls and letters were, we want to know what he thinks about transit. We don't care about his faith. And for me, that was a very big moment. Now, to finish the story, the moment I was elected, I suddenly became very famous. The day after the election, CNN and Time Magazine and Al Jazeera and whoever else wanted to talk to me. And they weren't interested in my amazing come from behind victory or what I thought about transit. That all came later. They weren't interested in the color of my skin. They were interested only in my faith. I did not realize at that time that I was the first elected Muslim mayor of any city in the Western world, of any major city in the Western world. And I had a choice at that moment, which is I could talk about this or I could ignore it. I could say it wasn't an issue in the campaign. Why does it matter? And at that moment back in 2010, I chose to talk about it because I felt an increasing wave of Islamophobia. And I thought, here's an opportunity to tell a good news story about a place where Muslims are doing well and can succeed. And so I did, and I've been telling that story ever since. But finally, the national newspaper in Canada, the Globe and Mail, finally stopped referring to me as Calgary's Muslim mayor like 2.5 years later.
Right. Mayor Siddiqui, same question for you. The concept of your faith growing up on the heels and getting your education on the heels of September 11th, like how much was thinking about your identity, both not a hindrance, but how much of that was part of your cognition when putting your name on the ballot?
Yeah, I think Mayor Naheed summed it up pretty well. I think we're very similar in that respect. I think as I was running, it would come up. People would ask, "Oh, Siddiqui, where are you from?" There's some ignorant people who would say, "Oh, Siddiqui, there was a terrorist by that name." They'd say stuff like that, and I would just, I just say, well, I interact with these people somewhat as I was door knocking and so forth, and just say, well, you can't stereotype like that, and I'd correct that and move on my way. And then when I was first elected, I think there was a Muslim on the city council prior to who had decided not to run. So it felt, people were like, oh, we need a Muslim, we need a Muslim on the council. And so it's a little bit of this somewhat tokenism of, we need a Muslim and what that means. And then eventually I think, we do have a big, large Muslim population. And for me, and it's a very low income population as well. And so eventually it kind of became more of a, this was my constituency, part of it constituency. And I really felt like it was very important for me to be there. And then when I was elected mayor, I think there were these headlines of the state's first Muslim mayor and other headlines. And they would never focus on the fact that I was the youngest mayor. They would never focus on the fact that, I had a law degree. It was always about the faith. And I would say, it'd be great if they could mention all these other things about me that are also really critical to my identity. But, I think at the end of the day, as soon as I was elected, the messages that I got from people in the community who were just so proud and who felt like they could finally call City Hall and felt heard. And so that for me has been a really important part of the work that I have been doing. And we do a huge community iftar every year, not this year, unfortunately, but even before I was elected, the city had been really trying to do that. And so, it's played a role. I think, again, as Mayor Naheed said, I think we also have, as first, there's all these responsibilities too that come with it, and expectations and what that means. And so sometimes I struggle with that, but as a whole, I think my identity, my Muslim faith, it shapes me. It's a part of me. I think, that's how I kind of do the work I do.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to get back to this public service concept near the end of our talk as well. And I think I really appreciate both of you sharing these stories, because I think they are inspirations. And both of you setting the foundations for others who may be flirting with this idea, might be thinking about the importance of public service, especially at the crossroads we find ourselves in right now. So I do want to talk about cities, and I'm going to get into that right now. And I also want to make mention as a housekeeping note, if you have questions and you're listening in, please fill them in the chat. I will weave them into our conversation. Mayor Siddiqui, I want to go back to you, which is you were elected mayor in January of 2020 of this year. And so you become mayor. You haven't really had any peacetime, have you? Because you've been dealing with this concept of the coronavirus coming in and now having to face this coronavirus head on. Tell us about your situation. You haven't really experienced a normal sort of stability, but tell us about what's going on in your city. What's kind of sticking out for you? What does even your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, it's been a really challenging time. I think for the world, it's been complicated. It's been heartbreaking. We've lost members of our community. We've seen so many thousands of folks lose jobs. But at the same time, we've also witnessed so much generosity, right? So many reasons to hope. And Cambridge is about 110,000 people, and we're a very dense city. As far as the state goes, I think Massachusetts has become an epicenter for COVID in the U.S. It's has the third, most cases and the fourth most fatalities, and so it has been challenging. In Cambridge, in particular, we've had about 860 cases so far. About 66 individuals have passed. And so, I think for me, it's shifted from this role, which is inherently a lot of events and, there's a lot of ceremonial aspects to this job that, as soon as this crisis hit, all of that has been pushed aside. And it's been a really all hands on deck approach with my team, the city manager's team, to work around the clock to figure out how we can really best respond to our most vulnerable residents. And so I can get into some specifics later about what the city has done. But the day-to-day is, there's no day that's the same. That's what I've realized. And there's no, you constantly have to adapt. You constantly have to think about the new information that's coming in and responding to it, and really, really working together with people. I think that's been key. We've been really in partnership with our public health department, our public safety agencies, the state. We've had such lack of leadership on the federal level, and that has really translated into the numbers that we're seeing in the U.S. And then we've had state leadership, but even the state leadership from the governor, I think, in my opinion, was slow. But as a city, we've had to really sometimes come out ahead of the governor too. So that's been, I think a lot of the municipalities have had to lead in this situation. And so it's been challenging, but at the same time, it's also, you see how, cities have, I think Cambridge has said, oh, we can't really figure that out yet. But this problem has allowed us to innovate and has allowed us to do things that we would probably not done. An example of is, we had to put everything to do, move everything to remote learning after we closed the school. So we realized, okay, we have to get all the students who don't have any access to technology, we have to get them hotspots. We have to get them, so we got 400 hotspots for families. We got Chromebooks for, junior kindergarten to end of high school. We did all this, which, we probably should have been doing before, right? But, we've been, and so now, it's also been eye-opening, all these things that we said no to, or said, oh, we'll figure out how to, fix the digital divide. So that's been also a great learning experience for me too. So all that to say, we've had to really shift gears and really look at the data that's coming in and respond accordingly.
I want to follow up on this because I love the example of Chromebooks. And you said, there's some specifics that you guys have been focusing on as your city and your city council. Can you tell us about a few of those? Like, where have you been putting your energy? And in a situation where you may have thought about this more conceptually versus actually being in it, is it surprising you where you are spending your time and what you're spending your time on? I'm just kind of curious to learn what that's looking like for you day to day these days.
Yeah, so we right away started thinking about, okay, what are our most vulnerable going to need? They're going to need access to food. So we set up a robust meal distribution sites across the city. We also set up a hotline for folks who can't get food for any reason, a grocery delivery program. We right away we did the remote learning piece that I mentioned too, and then I also reactivated the Mayor's Disaster Relief Fund, which has come into use based on situations. We've had fires, we've had other things that initiated the fund, but this fund now has raised about almost $4 million. And so the money, and Cambridge, Massachusetts is home to, I think, the world's, we have so many, we're really lucky to have all the biotech and companies here who have not only, contributed financially, but, they've been contributing through, providing PPE and all sorts of things. So that fund has been helping families with rent and household expenses. And so part of the fund is also going to be helping small businesses. And so it's really about different sectors. And now our next sector is figuring out how do we support the nonprofit community, right? There's all these, how do we support our restaurants? So early on, we realized that so many of our homeless shelters have had to close. And then the ones that are still open, they don't have staff, to make meals. So we partnered, we provided, contracts with restaurants to provide food to these homeless shelters. And, because you have two problems, right? You have our restaurants hurting, and then you have to provide meals to our most vulnerable. And so we are able to, really innovate and figure out ways to do things that could solve these problems. We built a temporary homeless shelter as well. So the list, there's a really thinking about different segments of the population, which includes seniors as well. And for me, what's been key is making sure, even with the Mayor's Disaster Relief Fund, we've had, we have a phone line where it's offered in 8 languages. So you can call and, if you speak Chinese, it'll go to someone who speaks Chinese, Bangla, Arabic, and so forth. And making sure things are as accessible as possible for our residents, and in different messages, and really making sure we're getting to the most vulnerable in the community. And recently on Friday, we just initiated universal testing for all Cambridge residents, regardless of immigration status. And so we're making progress. I think there's a lot of bumps in the road, but we've been able to, we were with a partnership early on with the Broad Institute through MIT and Harvard. We were able to get early testing in our nursing facilities, and then in our homeless shelters. And now we've been able to do enough testing, start enough testing for all residents, as I said. So, these types of measures, I think 2 months ago, couldn't foresee some of these pieces taking place because we just didn't know the capacity, right? But we've been able to get to this point so that it feels good.
That's great, and thank you for sharing that insight with us. Mayor Nenshi, this concept of a crisis is not new to you. In your term, Calgary, for those who may not know, had a 100-year flood that was significant and required significant crisis planning, crisis resources, and now you face a different type of emergency and crisis. Tell us about, the difference between the two. What surprised you, how you're spending time from one to another? Because I think you bring a very unique perspective of, frankly, how cities have even changed in that period in time, and where maybe resourcing has been made available. And I'm just kind of curious to hear your story and where.
Well, thanks, Zane. In the whole long history of the city of Calgary, we have declared a state of local emergency twice. And lucky me, I got to be the mayor who signed both of them. And so we have been through something similar to this before. As you say, we had a 1 in 100-year flood just 7 years ago, which was at the time the costliest natural disaster in Canadian history, about $6 billion in damage. But only one life lost in the city of Calgary, and that was a tough funeral to go to. But at the same time, we were able to respond to keep everyone safe. Now, this, of course, is completely different. The flood started on a Thursday, and the waters are receding by Saturday. And then the job of recovery and resilience began, and it continues to this day. This, of course, is something that, and by the way, during the flood, only about 10% of the city was underwater. So 90% was still dry, and the people who lived in that 90% were able to mobilize very quickly to help the others. And I can go on and on about that, and I will in a second. But this is completely different. This is, of course, something that is impacting every single person in the world. And it's something whose duration is measured not in days and not in weeks, but in months, maybe in years. And so we've had to figure out very quickly how we work very differently. And a lot of the lessons that we learned the last time continue to be things that we rely on every day. The biggest lessons were the following. Number one is communication. The old school thinking about crisis management was, you very carefully restrict the information that people are getting so that people who are in danger can focus on the things that are the most important, and they don't have a bunch of extraneous things coming at them. And in the flood, we decided to do it differently. We decided that anything the city knew, anything the government knew, citizens would also know, unless there was a compelling public safety reason to hold back the information. And I remember saying at that time, and I think you, Mayor Siddiqui, I think you and I share a weak mayor-city manager system, so I didn't really have the power to say this, but I said it anyway, which was, anything you want to hold back, it comes through me, and you have to explain to me why you're holding it back. And we never did, actually. We were able to provide people with the information, all the information, so that they could make their own decisions. Because my political philosophy, I'm neither red nor blue, to use those terms. I wear purple every day because I try to talk about how we all come together regardless of partisanship. But I do have a political philosophy, and my political philosophy is that people aren't idiots, that you can actually trust citizens when given the right information to do the right thing. And so that was number one. And number two was something that we really learned as we went along, which is give people the opportunity to help. And I won't take up all of your time now. Maybe at a future Concordia Forum, I'll tell you the big story of the flood. But one of our big learnings was really that people could organize themselves to help. I'll tell you the real short version of the story, which is, at one point, we asked people to gather in the parking lot of the football stadium to see if they wanted to help. And I had been pushing the public servants hard on, we got to let people help. There's this huge groundswell, right? We can't keep them out of the whole thing. And so they announced at like 7 a.m. that if people want to help with cleanup, they can meet at the football stadium at 10 a.m. And when I woke up that morning, I'd finally gotten home and gotten some sleep. I heard on the radio that, you know, the mayor is asking people to come at 10 a.m. And I was like, what? So I phoned and said, what's going on? And they said, well, we took your advice, and we knew that if we didn't do anything, you'd be super mad. So this is what we're doing. We're organizing people. We have school buses and so on coming. And I said, well, you announced it at 7 so that people would come at 10. You know nobody's going to show up, right? And they said, well, that's our plan. And I said, what? And they said, well, we don't know what we're doing. So we're hoping a very small number of people show up so that we can figure out how to deal with them. And then tomorrow we'll do it again and more people will come. And I thought, geez, I am so sleep deprived. And I've been in public life for so long that that almost made sense to me. But I figured I would just show up anyway. And when I got there, there were thousands of people and in this parking lot waiting to do something. And there was no PA system, nothing had been set up. And one of my colleagues was standing on a folding table trying to address the crowd. And when he saw me, he scrambled down and he said, you tell them. And I said, tell them what? And he said, tell them to go home. We've run out of forms for them to fill out. And so I stood up there and visions of municipal lawyers danced before my eyes. And I just said, all right, folks, we've run out of forms. There's no more room on the school buses that are going to the flooded areas. But you know what? You're here to help. So just go help. Just go. The only thing I ask of you is keep yourself safe. And they went and they went and they went, and the thousands and tens of thousands they went. And as a professor of nonprofit management, I thought, geez, if I was still a professor, this would be the rest of my life, is figuring out how this group of people self-organize themselves into the greatest volunteer force I've ever seen. So because we knew that this time, we really gave people the ability to do that. So we've got huge groups of volunteers sewing masks. We have a Facebook page that we had nothing to do with. It was just set up, that has tens of thousands of members. And it's just become I'm stuck in my house. I live in this neighborhood. I need groceries. And then 20 people underneath say, all right, I'm on my way. And that power and resilience of human beings looking after one another, I think, is the single most important thing that we've learned about managing in a crisis.
You know, and thank you for mentioning that civil society piece as well. Mayor Siddiqui, can you talk about like where civil society has kind of fit in, where the kind of public volunteer response has fit in Cambridge? What's that look like? Has it surprised you? I'm curious to hear your tale there.
Yeah, no, very similar. I think it's been the mobilization I've seen from people who want to help, right, is one of the, things that has been so, the response has been so overwhelming, right? We've, similar to, the volunteers in Calgary, we have volunteers making face masks, making face coverings, really wanting to help members of the community, whether it's groceries. We've had we have a bike safety, really strong bike safety advocacy group, and who said, look, we'll partner with some of our local grocery stores and deliver do deliveries for our senior residents, right? Like, just things like that on a day-to-day basis. I've seen happen, and it's there's a really strong desire for people during this time to help one another and be there for one another as much as possible.
Here's what I want to kind of talk about is the general sort of messaging about the pandemic, and then what you kind of feel like changes going forward. I think that's the $1 million question to me is you just talked about, Mayor Siddiqui, about the digital divide. You should have done this a long time ago, but now you've got the opportunity to do it. You've done it. How do you think this kind of changes cities going forward? So Mayor Nenshi, I may go to you on this. You guys are putting in emergency protocols in place. You're probably experiencing net new measures for everything from streets to sidewalks to transit. What about this sticks? And what about this, would you actually want to use your political capital to spend on going forward? I'm kind of curious to hear what you feel like will last beyond a pandemic. It might be hard to say because we're in it, but I want to throw it over to you on that one first.
Well, no, I think it's a really important piece of our jobs, Mayor Siddiqui's job and my job, to make sure, and for everybody actually, if I can deign to give some advice to everybody, is that when you're in a pandemic like this, you've got to set up some time and some mental capacity, even if it's 2% of your brain or 5% of your brain, thinking about what comes next. And because this pandemic has been so long, it is really allowing us to think about, what does the recovery phase look like? What does the long-term resilience phase look like? So just to tell you a little bit about Calgary, so you understand where we're coming from, is Calgary is being hit right now by a triple whammy. We have the public health crisis of the virus, and we are one of the hotspots in Canada. In fact, we have one hotspot, which was a outbreak at a meat packing plant just south of Calgary, where most of the people live in Calgary. The people that work there, mostly new Canadians, mostly from the Filipino and East African communities, mostly living in large multi-generational homes, mostly with spouses who work in healthcare. And that is, in fact, the largest outbreak in North America. Over 1,500 people impacted by that outbreak. And so we've got the public health crisis. We have the issues of the global recession that's hitting everybody, and particularly how it's hitting in every city, small business, street front retail, and those kinds of businesses. And we have, because Calgary is a very energy-based economy, we have the results of the ridiculous global price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia in oil, as we are struggling with an energy transition of our own. So it's probably not too much to say that Calgary will be hit as hard by this crisis economically as anywhere else in the Western world. And so as a result, we have this very difficult situation. We were just climbing out of a very perilous economic downturn when all of this started. And we're now faced with, what does resilience and recovery look like going forward? And so I spent a lot of my time thinking about what that means. But without getting into all the boring details, I will share with you my big thinking. And I love what you were saying about the digital divide, Mayor Siddiqui. We did something similar, and I had the exact similar thought, which is, why didn't we fix this before? But for me, one of the challenges I've had, and our biggest public health challenge, is what happens if the virus starts to spread in the homeless population? If you cannot have access to a sink to wash your hands or hand sanitizer, then all of our public health messaging is ridiculous to you. If you cannot self-isolate and you're sleeping on a mat on a floor, then how in the world do you stay healthy? And there was a photo that was taken, and I had gotten in a big fight with our provincial government about where we were going to put homeless people. My argument was, let's kill two birds with one stone. Our tourism industry is completely dead. Our hotels are completely closed. So let's reopen the hotels and isolate homeless people in hotel rooms where they can have 4 walls and a door. And to me, I thought that would also be a very positive vector in many people's lives, that this could be an inflection point of a little bit of stability during a pandemic, which might help them get to more stable situations in the future. And I was dealing with a very old school provincial government who follows a philosophy that homeless people are broken and need to be fixed before they can return to regular life. And they said, we don't trust homeless people if they're in a hotel room. They will have sex work and drug dealing, and they're going to trash the rooms and steal the TVs. And I actually said to the premier, that's like a governor, you know, I'm Gujarati. So that means that my people own hotels. That's what we do. And my family, in fact, did run a motel for a while. And I can tell you that sex work and drug dealing happen in every hotel. And hoteliers know how to deal with them. It happens in the Four Seasons. It happens in the Best Western. We know how to deal with it. But they wouldn't listen. And so they ended up having these overflow shelters set up, one of which was in a church, one of those massive mega churches. And they're great people. They're good people. They jumped to the help as soon as they could. And they've covered every inch of that giant church with basically wrestling mats from high school gyms that are like 3 feet apart, not even following the 2-meter protocol of how far apart you need to be. And a lot of people saw that picture and went, that's inhuman. How can we treat people like that? And I said, you know, that's actually what the shelter looks like. That's how we treat people 365 nights a year. And so my big dream out of all of this is, as we've disrupted the shelter system, I am working hard with the federal and provincial governments to say, how about if nobody ever goes back to the shelter? How about if we use this as an opportunity to finally take care of our philosophy that we call housing first, which is a common philosophy in many places? How about we actually do it for once? And we know it's cheaper than keeping people in the shelter long term. So how about we actually make a commitment that at the end of this pandemic, every single person who is living in shelter has permanent supportive housing or is in treatment? Haven't gotten anywhere yet, but I think these are our opportunities through all of this.
That's a remarkable ambition, and I think just one that I think many people are starting to see as that picture, especially, you know, as a fellow Calgarian, seeing the picture of our convention center lined up with those mats side by side, very much comparable to the picture that, you know, went viral across North America of homeless people sleeping in the parking lot just outside of these hotel rooms in Las Vegas, where they had tons of capacity. So I think it was very similar in its scope in terms of what some of the rumblings it caused here in Calgary. Mayor Siddiqui, for you, like what do you kind of see as being part of the new normal? Is there anything you're going to be fighting for to kind of keep part of the current sort of pandemic response that you now want to ensure is part of the new refreshed, you know, civil society and municipal society going forward? Is there any policies that you're anticipating will have to stay for a while? I'm kind of curious where your head's at and what you've been discussing.
Yeah, sure. No, I think Mayor, he just did a great job of explaining a situation where we're in a pretty similar boat. You know, I think we've actually had reached out to hotels and our dorms at MIT, Harvard, for example, and wanted to provide as many opportunities for folks to, you know, self-quarantine, isolate, you know, because these are such privileged words, right? You know, we've issued these stay-at-home advisories or, you know, orders, and the reality is so many people don't have homes. And so it has, you know, coming from a very, you know, tenant-heavy, tenant displacement policy background, I think for me moving forward, and just as similar to what Mayor Naheed said, how does Cambridge provide more affordable housing? It's very expensive to live in Cambridge. You know, even to buy something, a single family home is $1.9 million. So,
wow,
you know, 1.9 million. So it's very challenging to live here, and much of what we have built, the market rate, you know, sure, we have inclusionary zoning, which says whatever you're building, 20% has to be affordable. And we've gotten many units that way. But, you know, how do we push on that? You know, we've floated around zoning that last year did not ultimately pass, that we are hopeful to bring back again, which is, you know, having something called an affordable housing overlay, and providing incentives to just build affordable housing. And so this, I think, this situation and seeing the struggle that so many tenants are facing, in addition to our unsheltered community, has really, for me, you know, pushed this piece around, you know, permanent supportive housing. And so that's something that I think all of the council will be pushing for as we continue this term. And then in addition, you know, what I said earlier about the digital divide, right? I think we know there's so many families who don't have internet at home, and individuals who, you know, they're not accessing unemployment benefits, right? They literally can't because they don't have access to internet. And so how do we, you know, municipal broadband is not a popular topic with our city manager. And so that's where there's some, you know, tension there, but I think this crisis is showing just how important and that of a basic need that is. And so how we as a city pushes that, I'm curious, and I think that's something that I'm myself and many of my colleagues on the council are committed to pushing as this continues. I think right now we also as a city stopped construction, and many cities didn't do that. We have big construction sites in Cambridge. There's a lot of development that happens here, and so we're slowly now bringing that back, and it's a question of how we're doing it. So we've appointed a construction advisory group, you know, same with how do we bring businesses back. We're not to a point of bringing, you know, it's going to probably be another month before construction starts, but in another, who knows how long before, what businesses and what main streets will look like the next few months. I think there's so much we don't know, but right now we are trying to figure out, you know, is it going to be curbside retail, right? There's all these things that we are in conversations about, and I think it's really looking at the next 18 months. And then that brings us to the end of the term. So I think I pretty much know that this term for me will be about the recovery post COVID, and then, you know, thinking as we go through the recovery, thinking about these larger policy initiatives as well. But it is hard to think about the future, but you know, there's so many issues that have come up because of this crisis, and this goes back to also the numbers we're seeing about who's getting affected, right? Mm-hmm. The Black community in Cambridge is 3 times more likely to be testing positive, right? And so it's been very challenging, and we've seen these, you know, these health disparities come up in communities of color, especially in Massachusetts. It's Black and Latino population that is being devastated, and we knew that this would happen. And again, we've, I think, struggled to figure out, okay, well, now what do we do with this? And in Cambridge, certainly, this, you know, as we rolled out universal testing, we did it in an area of town, which it was the best place to do it. But then, you know, I said, this is not in the area code that has the highest cases. That area code is, you know, very dense, and it's one of the poorest areas of town. We need to be providing some kind of mobile testing in these other areas as well, because of the results we're seeing and the disparities we're seeing. And so how we reflect on the disparities that we're seeing and what they mean, I think that's something that is going to be challenging, but I think something that as a city we have to grapple with.
You know, Mayor Siddiqui, you just brought up this concept of the recovery period and how you're term might be defined by that. I want to talk about that a bit more, and we got about 10 minutes left. So, Mayor Nenshi, when we talk about recovery, reopening, those conversations are now being flirted around with. Right? In fact, in our province of Alberta, there's a date for certain things to reopen.
This Thursday.
That's right. So for
wow.
you, as a mayor of Alberta's largest city, what does it take for you to kind of commit to a reopening, like in terms of mask wearing and in terms of following certain protocols? Where does this kind of go from here? And you guys have both mentioned, in I shouldn't say in implicit terms, but in explicit terms, the tension between your governors or your premiers and your other orders of government. So as a city, what does it look like in terms of having people look at things like mask wearing, testing, et cetera?
So this is terribly complicated. And I want to highlight something that I'm sure Mayor Siddiqui thinks about every day, which is every decision that we make has to be made looking at 3 different gauges: physical health, mental health, and economic health. And for the last several weeks, physical health, public health has been by far the most important. And we've been fully aware that some of the decisions that we make in order to protect people's physical health have had detrimental impacts on their mental health, and certainly very detrimental impacts on overall economic health. And so we're now at the point where we have to make some very tough decisions about how we move forward, because we know that as this will last, as Mayor Siddiqui says, 12, 18 months before there's a vaccine at the outside, we have to think about how we continue living as a society. And so when you heard all that talk about flattening the curve, right? When you think about it from a statistical perspective, flattening the curve doesn't mean fewer people get the illness. It means we spread the cases over a longer period of time so that the healthcare system isn't overwhelmed. And here in Alberta, and in fact in most places, we managed to do that very well. So I've been quoting a meme a lot lately saying, and I don't like using the terms reopening or relaunching, I've just been saying easing restrictions. Mm-hmm. Easing restrictions doesn't mean that the virus is gone. There's still no cure. There's still no treatment. There's still no vaccine. What it means is that there's room in the ICU for you. And by the way, 80% of people in New York State who went on ventilators died anyway. And so we individually, as the economy reopens or as we ease restrictions, we individually have to double down on our individual behaviors to prevent spreading the virus. So we've had public health, for example, we've had public health advice for a few weeks now from the provincial and federal government saying you should wear a mask in crowded public gatherings, or you should have a face covering. And we haven't done a thing about it. Like, we just talk about it, but we don't enforce it. We don't talk about it. And so I've been saying a lot, face coverings, you got to wear them. And I've had pictures of myself taken wearing a face covering so that people can start to see that a little bit more, that physical distancing becomes even more important as we start to relaunch our economy. Now, the funny thing is, here in Alberta, we never closed down quite as hard as other places. So curbside pickup from retailers was always available. You could open for curbside pickup. We never closed that down. We never told people they couldn't go outside and enjoy the parks or enjoy the fresh air. We closed the playgrounds because high touch area is hard to do contact tracing. But we left the parks and the pathways open. In fact, we closed some lanes of some roads to give people more room to walk and bike and get some exercise. But I'm very nervous. So this week, we allow stores to open. This week, we allow restaurants to open at 50% of their capacity. They've always been open for pickup and takeout and delivery, but now they open for dine-in, some of them, at 50% capacity. Most of them find they can't make money at that level, so they probably won't reopen anyway. So I'm very nervous about this. And there's one other thing I should mention, which is that if anything, what we've learned through this crisis is that our entire economy and what we value in the economy is upside down. Because, I used to be a management consultant, and here's the thing, nobody needs a management consultant right now. Well, maybe to make the testing work a little bit better, but not much more than that. Nobody needs a securities lawyer right now. What we need are cleaners and grocery store clerks and people who work in meat packing plants. And these are the lowest paid people in our community, and bus drivers, waste collectors. These are by and large the lowest paid people in our community, and they're the ones we've been sending out. While people who have white collar jobs and politicians get to sit at home and work from home. And there's a reckoning, and we've got to think hard about, as we start to reopen once again. I haven't heard from any waiters or waitresses who are dying for restaurants to reopen, but I've heard from their patrons saying, I want my restaurants to reopen. I want to be served. And so this is where we do have to reopen the economy. There's no question. We cannot continue in this state, but we have to do so in a way that is thoughtful, that provides some modicum of safety for people, and it requires individuals, all of us, to work doubly and triply hard to make sure we're keeping ourselves and those we come into contact with safe. So my simple advice I've been giving everyone, I've been saying from the very beginning of this, just 3 phrases: clean hands, clear heads, open hearts. And clean hands means, it doesn't just mean wash your hands. It means do everything you can to prevent the spread of the virus. It means don't act like someone who doesn't want to get the virus, act like someone who has it and doesn't want to spread it. And act like every single person you come into contact with is your 90-year-old grandmother. And so that's probably the best advice I can leave folks with. Clean hands, clear heads, open hearts.
I've got a few more questions, and we only got about 5 minutes left. So Mayor Siddiqui, same question to you in terms of, any baseline of what you need as a reopening to be able to feel comfortable. I know we've talked about a few of them, but is there anything that sticks out that Mayor Nenshi may not have said in his remarks that you are also considering as something that is like a mandatory minimum for you to have in place before like a reopening or an easing can happen?
Yeah, I think, the governor has said May 18th, but we know that's probably going to get extended probably another two weeks, probably June. We're looking around June. I think right now it is based on the number of cases. And again, it goes back to the data. I think it's too early to, as the mayor said, ease any restrictions. In Cambridge, we initiated making face coverings mandatory. But what we said was we're going to provide the face masks, the coverings if you need it. And we had our Cambridge Police Department, which at first I was like, people aren't going to necessarily be comfortable with the police, but we have a number of social workers on our police task force. And so we kind of utilized ways of making it, providing, face coverings to people, providing the cruisers with face coverings, at our meal sites, providing face coverings. So really saying, look, we don't want to fine you $300, right? That's the last thing we want to do, but this is very important. And so we've seen much more compliance with that respect, and people taking it very seriously. That's just an anecdote, but I think right now, similar, we know that economic health is very important. But what we don't want to happen is we move so fast, and then we're going to then have to really double down again. And I think that's why I think Massachusetts, given the number of cases that we have in the state, we're taking a much more cautious approach, and we have to do more testing and more contact tracing before we ease some of the restrictions. So time will tell. I think this next month is really critical as we look at how the numbers. It has we've been told at least 14 days of declining cases, and that necessarily hasn't happened yet. But we're looking at these type of data to inform some of our policy going forward.
I really appreciate that. And I see, Sarah, you're asking some questions that are coming in. I don't think we'll unfortunately have time for those, as we only have about a minute or so.
Oh, Zane, I gotta give 10 seconds to that second question.
Do you want to ask that second question around the, lay it on me, so just so people see.
Which is I'm just being ironic here, which is I've spent much of the last year arguing against this ridiculous law in the province of Quebec that bans the use of religious face coverings, in fact, headscarves, all religious items, and suddenly totally okay to go into a store wearing a mask. It was never about security at all.
and I know you and I have talked about this quite a bit around that Bill 21 in Quebec and what the future of kind of minority rights in that province, and frankly, what the implication of that is across the country looks like going forward. With my minute left here, I want to ask you guys one final rapid fire question. I appreciate both of you for the generosity of your time before I turn it back to Mudassir or Zahid here. What has this, and it's hard, maybe hard to answer because we're still in it, and I think that needs to be reinforced because we're still in this thing. But what about this pandemic has kind of taught you a new lesson or reinforced a current sort of learning that you've had? I know you guys have both floated a few things, but if you could punctuate it with a lesson or two that this is just illuminated to a degree you've never seen before or created for you, what would that be? So maybe Mayor Nenshi, I can start with you and then I'll go back to Mayor Siddiqui.
Human beings are endlessly resilient in terms of dealing with change. When I think about my own world, that I went from telling people, you should probably not be shaking hands with others, to a complete shutdown of the city in 5 days. And the city was able to move so quickly and restart classes online and do this kind of work, shows me that a lot of what we think is true about the way things used to be may not always be true, and we are adaptable and we can change.
I love it. And Mayor Siddiqui, same question to you. What is this pandemic kind of reinforced to you as a lesson going forward?
I think it's just reinforced how important it is to work, even if you disagree, really collaboratively as much as possible, and with the partners around you. I think we've really realized, with Cambridge, it was very important for us to work with neighboring cities and talk to 10, 12 communities nearby and say, look, we're all in this together. Let's act accordingly. Maybe the governor's not there with us, but if we stay together and we set this policy, it's going to be very important how we do things together. I think there's a lot of, we didn't have to work with other cities, but it has been, it's really reinforced for me how important that collaboration is during crisis. So.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here on a Sunday to answer these questions. I hope this was illuminating to the participants, and once again, thank you so much for making yourselves available and for the public service that you've done, not just in this moment of crisis, but that you've effectively driven towards to being in this moment. I mean, I could not imagine to have people not as resilient, as educated, as thoughtful, and as mindful as you guys leading your respective cities. So thank you so much for being here and for doing what you do. Can I push it over? Zahid, am I going to you? Yes, perfect.
Thank
I'll
you.
go to you. Of course. Oh, you're on mute, Zahid.
Thank you so much, Mayor Naheed, Mayor Symbol, for that enlightening discussion. We're really, really honored to have you with us and sharing your time with us, and especially with your perspectives from your respective posts. We're going to transition now to the next session. It is a conversation with Representative Andre Carson, hosted by my good friend Salma Moriarty from the Muslim Public Affairs Council. And